Not one of the workers was asking someone to help them dig themselves out, but every one of the workers was excited about the thought of someone coming from the outside to pull them out. And who could blame them? These Chilean miners were 2,000 feet beneath the surface, trapped in a mine. For 2 months, 2,000 feet below the Earth's surface, they were trapped. Many days they survived on nothing but a spoonful of tuna, a small dose of peaches, or a sip of milk. They did their best to keep each other encouraged. They would exercise. They had carved out their own natural water deposit. They spent their time at the very place that they hoped that the rescuers would find them. Meanwhile, 2,000 feet above them, rescuers were busy devising a plan. Consulting NASA, calling in experts, the Chilean government was determined that they were going to rescue these men. They created, if you remember, a 13-foot tall rescue capsule. And they had drilled 2 holes. The first for communication, and the second for excavation. But they had no guarantee that they would successfully retrieve these men. You see, no men had ever been trapped beneath the surface of the earth for so long that they had lived to tell about it. But now they had, because on October the 13th of 2010, one of the miners began to emerge, one by one. Felicio Alvaldo was the first one to be rescued. His young son and the president of Chile was there waiting for him. The second man, I don't know if you remember, he was the one who burst out of the capsule and giving high fives and victory chants, and then came a grandfather, and then came a 44-year-old that was planning a church wedding for his daughter, and then a 19-year-old, and with each rescue was a victory, and each rescue was a story. Like the story of Yanni Valvosa. 2 women were waiting on him to come out. One was his wife of 31 years. The other was his mistress. The first didn't know about the second. Maybe that's why he was among the last to come out. Number 24 was Jose Enriquez, and he was the man that had requested 33 Bibles be lowered into the cavern because they were doing a daily Bible study. My hunch was that attendance was very high. After all, when you're trapped a half mile below ground, you need all the help you can get. And they all accepted it. Not one turned away the offer with a declaration of muscle. No one sent out a message to the rescuers saying, I can get there on my own, I'll be fine. Just give me one more day and I'll just dig my way out of this mess. Nobody said that. In fact, they unanimously concluded that they needed help. We need somebody to penetrate this world down here and pull us out. It's not that it's a bad world. It's just that somewhere along the way we realize that we're not made for this world. Even though it has its moments, it's a dark, cavernous place. Or you can paint the walls as often as you want and as bright as you want, but somehow, don't you just know deep down that you're cut off from the source of light? That you weren't made to live in a world that's been marred by death and decay and cancer and corruption. So how do you get out? Well, that's the question. And God's answer is a word that every person cherishes. And it's a word that I bet every single one of us in here know. And it's grace. To hear it, you would think that we would understand the word, that we talk about how the teacher would give a student a grace period, how the politician will fall from grace, how the dancer is graceful, how the hostess is gracious, and we use the word grace to name the hospital or to name baby girls. And grace is something that we even say before we eat, but certainly there's more. Certainly there must be more to grace than eloquence and religious rituals, and that if you think that there isn't anything more to grace, then today I have a surprise for you. In fact, we might start with one of the sweetest surprises of all, and that's where the word grace first appears in the Bible. Do you know where the word grace, I've already given you the hint because I told you what chapter and verse and book of the Bible to go to, but do you know where the word grace first appears? Most people would think that it would come from the writings of the Apostle Paul. No one certainly wrote more about grace than Paul did, but Paul was not the first to write about grace. Others suggest that perhaps it came from the teaching of Jesus, and nobody taught more or lived grace more than our Master did, but he wasn't the first to mention it. King David, some might suggest, King David relied upon the grace of God, but he wasn't the first to mention the grace of God. I think, much like in a good Bible study, it takes a little bit of archaeology, a little bit of digging, and the deeper we dig, the further we go back, we learn more. And we understand the culture by discovering its beginnings. We understand a doctrine by going back to its beginnings. So where's the beginning of grace? Well, we find it right here in the book of beginnings. In Genesis. In Genesis chapter 6, here's what we read. Humans had begun to increase in number, and they were filling the earth. And look at verse 5. The Lord saw how great the wickedness of the human race had become. Let that sink in for just a moment. The Lord saw how great the wickedness on earth had become, and that every inclination of the thought of the human heart was only evil all the time. Verse 6 breaks my heart. The Lord regretted that he made human beings on the earth, and that his heart was deeply troubled. So the Lord said, I will wipe from the face of the earth the human race that I have created, and with them the animals and the birds and the creatures that move along the ground, for I regret that I have made them. Now, verse 8. But Noah found. In this translation it says favor, but in the original it says grace. But Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. Noah. Who would have thought about it? Noah. This ark building, flood surviving, animal herding, dove sending, rainbow discovering Noah. The word grace appears in the Bible when his name does. Now, why is that important? You think, why are we taking time to talk about this today? Well, I believe it's important because the word grace follows some of the most difficult words in all of the Scripture. That the Lord saw how great the wickedness on earth had become, and that every inclination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil all the time. Feel the force of those words. Wickedness was great. Every intent was evil. We're tempted to dismiss this as hyperbole or exaggeration, but we remember in our not-so-far history the skeletons of Auschwitz, the skulls of the Cambodian killing fields, the bodies of the Tutsis in Rwanda, the attack and the murderings of Israel and the Hamas. And we realize that it's possible for a society to sink to the point that every thought, every intention is evil continually. So how does it happen? And it happened in the days of Noah. But how? How did such evil happen? And how did it happen so quickly? I mean, it was just 6 chapters earlier. I mean, we're not even into the book. It was only 6 chapters earlier when we're reading about the perfection of kind. Remember in Genesis chapter 1 is where we have this stanza that's repeated 6 times, this certain rhythm that and God said, and it was good. And God said, and it was good. And God said, and it was good. 6 different times it's repeated that. And God said, let there be light, and it was good. Let there be land, and it was good. Let there be sea, and let there be animals, and it was good. And it was good, and it was good. And then the magnum opus, the greatest creation of all. So God created man in his own image, and in the image of God he had created him, male and female. He had created them. And God would bless this couple, and he told them to go and have babies, and he told them to have dominion and to help each other, and he told them to live a good life. And how could they do anything but? Their work was their play, animals were their friends, funerals were unknown, lions would lay with the lambs, skunks would not stink, the earth did not shake, the sky, it was clear and it didn't roar, and my friends, there would be a chance that the Atlanta Braves could once again win a World Series. It was paradise. It was perfect. They wore no shoes because there were no thorns. There was no clothing because there was nothing to hide. There was honesty and there was openness and there was acceptance, and they had each other. And in Hebrew, it's Ish and Isha. They shared not only the same creator, they shared the same name. He had her and she had him, and they both had God. God who would just tend to show up in the cool of the evening to take a stroll through the garden and around the lake. And Adam and Eve, we would get the impression, would walk with him. There was a sweetness, a perfectness. God who would walk hand in hand with his children. And he couldn't resist in saying how perfect this was. In verse 31, and God saw all that he had made. And this time it wasn't just good, it was what? Very good. 6 times he said it was good, but this time when he saw it all together, he said this is very good. Turn to your neighbor and say very good. And when God says that something is very good, we know that it's very good. But into this world of no fear, and into this world of all joy, slithers in a servant of evil, who asked the question, did God really say you mustn't eat from any tree in the garden? The question that he gives Eve is such a subtle one. He deposited within her heart this seed of distrust. Not the seed of anger, not the seed of rebellion. Those would follow. But the first seed that he would give rise to the others was the seed of distrust. What if God is holding back on you? What if there's something more? What if there's something better? Has God really said, what if? And Eve distrusted. She grew suspicious of God, and she decided that her plan was better than his plan. And in order for her to reach the forbidden fruit, she had to release the hand of her father. And when she did, that was Satan's cue to release all his dominions in the garden. And they did. And they didn't have to be given a second opportunity. And they came scampering in, and for the first time, fear comes scampering into the garden. Pride comes into the garden. Shame comes into the garden. Fear forced them into hiding. Pride caused Adam to blame Eve. Shame caused them to cover themselves in fig leaves and lame excuses and explanations. And as fast as you can say chaos, paradise is exactly that. Their firstborn killed their secondborn. One of their descendants decided that one wife wasn't enough and they had to have more. Blood spattered all over the family tree as relative fought relative and nation fought nation. And by the time we read in Genesis chapter 6, they have descended into this pit that isn't 2,000 feet deep of hard rock, but 7 generations of hard hearts. And nobody is talking about Eden anymore. that when God saw what had happened, he had had enough. The Lord was grieved that he had made man on earth, and his heart was filled with pain. So he says, I'm going to wipe mankind off the face of the earth. This man that I have created, men and animals and creatures who move along the ground and birds of the air, for I am grieved that I have made them. God who just not sees the action of men, but the intent of men. And the intent of man was nothing but evil, and decided that it would be best to bring it all to an end. No one was craving closeness with God. No one from the fall was longing for the garden except one, Noah. Noah. He just kind of pops up in Scripture. He just appears. This is the first reference that we not just have to grace, but the first reference that we have to Noah. He shows up in verse 8 of Genesis chapter 6. But Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. Now, I really wish I could tell you more about Noah. How this descendant of Adam came to be good in a world gone bad. How this butterfly landed in a pigsty. I wish I could tell you what he did to find grace. Was he benevolent? Was he radical? Was he educated? Was he illuminated? Did he sleep on a bed of coals? Did he wear sandals? Did he ever eat? Did he eat all the time? I don't know. I don't know what Noah did. Did he pray? Did he fast? Did he pray fast? I don't know. We're just not told. If only Noah had told us. If only he had written a book that says, How I Found Grace When Nobody Else Did. Wouldn't that have been wonderful? 12 easy steps to God's grace. If he had just told us something, but he left us with nothing. No resume. Nothing. So what do we know about Noah? Nada. Nada. We don't know what he did. And listen to me. Let me be clear. We know what Noah did after he found grace. He built a boat. He saved the animals. He saved the human race. He became a preacher. He became a faith walker. He became a man of God whose faith is recorded in the New Testament book of Hebrews. But what he did before he found grace, we simply are not told. You know the reason why we call him Noah? Is we don't know a thing about him. I thought that was clever. Thank you. All we know is that he trusted God. And when God lowered a rescue capsule into his world, he climbed in. Isn't that interesting? That the flagship reference to grace in the whole Bible gives us no instruction on how to get it. You see, the appearance of grace in Grace 101, Day 1, brings this announcement. That grace is not up to the one that receives it, but grace is up to the one who gives it. And the big message of grace is not what we do, but it's what God does. And that grace doesn't depend upon the pedigree or the accomplishments of Noah. God knew that if we knew the accomplishments, we would try to imitate those and receive grace by ourselves. But maybe the reason Noah just kind of shows up out of nowhere is that the emphasis isn't upon him, but upon God. Noah found grace. Noah didn't find a reward for the work that he had did. Noah didn't find recognition for the accomplishments in his life. Noah didn't find an ability within himself. He didn't find the capacity to stand up and reach God. He found a God who was willing to stoop and reach him. The Hebrew word for the word grace comes from the very same word that we get the Hebrew word stoop. It comes from the same family, grace and stoop. I find that interesting. That God is God who stoops down, who's willing to reach down and pull someone up. He extends his hand into a dark world to lift them up. Noah found grace because God found Noah. Noah found grace before he pounded a nail. Noah found grace before he loaded an animal. He found grace before he swabbed a deck, before he opened an umbrella. Noah didn't find grace because he worked. Noah found grace because God did. And if you ever grow weary of working your way to God, friends, this is good news. This is good news. Who you couldn't use this kind of grace? Could you use the kind of grace that depends not on the goodness of the receiver, but on the goodness of the giver? Could you use the kind of grace that does not deepen our perfection of the person, but the faithfulness of God? Could you use the kind of grace that says, no matter how dark this world gets, wherever God finds a flicker of faith, he responds with the gift of grace. Couldn't you use that kind of grace? I mean, I know I could. I believe that you and I can agree that this world is not paradise. That the world we read about in Genesis chapter 1 is not the world in which we find ourselves. We find a world of fighting and harming and disunity and thieves and death. And no matter how many trying times we try to decorate the walls of the cavern, it just doesn't feel right. We know that there's a better world than this one. However, everyone keeps telling us that if you keep digging, you'll get it. If you dig a little bit more, the preacher, the priest, the rabbi, the teacher, the parent, the therapist, the message comes in different words, but the message is essentially the same. Dig. Be better, behave, be right, be long. They become the killer bees. Be this, be that. And in the midst of all these instructions on how to fix yourselves comes this message of grace that simply says, be still. Be still. Be quiet. Believe. Could it really be that simple? It was for those Chilean miners. The only instruction they were given upon their rescue was to step in. Step in and be pulled out. So they took a step of faith, and something wonderful happened. You see, I believe that God gives you and I the same invitation. That sometimes that invitation falls on deaf ears because we think this cavern is what life is all about. And the invitation falls on hungry ears because we're weary of this world, cut off from a source of light. But then we're ready. We're ready and we just don't know how. And the big announcement, at least the first announcement, is that God is taking responsibility for pulling us out. And something wonderful happens when we let him take over. Our question is a really simple one this morning. Are you willing to step in and be pulled out? Are you willing to see what happens when grace happens? Every one of those Chilean miners was greeted by the president of Chile as they came out. And he greeted them all with the word gracias. Gracias. And what is gracias without gracious, without grace? You see, my friends, grace is what God affords to you and I every day to be in relationship with his Son. It's simply grace. Would you bow your heads with me? I want you to think for just a moment. Are you in need of some grace this morning? Maybe today you've kind of played on the edge of whether or not you want to commit to Jesus with your whole heart. And you just kind of teetered on the line. Oh, my friend, if that's you today, then there's no better day than to receive the grace of the Savior. Or maybe you've been doing this walk for quite a while, and you need something refreshing and new, and that you need a special touch today from God that says, I just need to be reminded that He's still there. Maybe you're in a need for healing in your life. And you need that. Or you know somebody who is in desperate need of a touch from Jesus. And your heart is heavy for them. But today, we simply need to encounter His grace. If that's you today, take this moment quietly in your heart and say, God, that's me. That's me. And I need a special touch from you. Maybe you need to say, Jesus, I need to know you more. I want more of you, Jesus. Or maybe you just need to say, God, I just need to be reminded of why we do all this. There's words to an old hymn. It goes, grace, grace, God's grace, grace that will pardon and cleanse within. Grace, grace, God's grace, grace that is greater than all our sin. We're going to play one more song. I would invite you to stand. And as we stand and as we sing, I want you to just take this moment and think about this time that we've had with Jesus and how you need to encounter Him today. And then we'll come back and we'll close. But would you stand with me?